Welcome to the 11th USTelecom Cybersecurity Forum. I'm Jonathan Spalter. I am the President and CEO of USTelecom, and I'm really delighted not only to welcome everybody here in Washington, D.C., but equally and more expansively to all of our friends and colleagues who are joining us across the broadband networks via live stream, who are also with us today. And I really do think that we gather here today at a bit of an inflection point. Let me explain. Following the executive order from the President in May of last year, in 2017, to enhance the resiliency of our nation's internet and communications ecosystem, the Department of Commerce and the Department of Homeland Security have submitted their findings and recommendations back to the White House. And this is very important and precedential. The report is the culmination of an intense year of really unprecedented coordination among federal agencies, and its recommendations get at the very heart, I believe, of how together with industry stakeholders and innovators, we will dramatically reduce the threat of botnets and other automated distributed attacks. Most critically, the report's authors understood the need for consensus, collaboration, coordination between industry and civil society, government agencies, the academy, and beyond to prevent and mitigate these cyber attacks, which we now know really do threaten the very foundations of our global interconnected digital economy. And it is precisely this transparent and collaborative approach, call it a united front, that sends a very clear, pointed, and strong signal to our enemies that a more agile adversary, us, is awaiting them and awaiting their next moves. It is a very important and timely signal that we send together. The botnet threat is more severe today than at any previous point in the Internet's history. In the 1980s, botnets were conceived in a much more salubrious way as work-saving tools that allowed multiple machines to perform simple tasks automatically. Unfortunately, criminals and other bad actors in the ecosystem realized that they could exploit and leverage botnet technology to control systems all over the world without permission from the owners. And over time, these criminals, and we really need to call them what they are, criminals, have created increasingly large networks of bot-infected computers, which today are being used to launch cyber attacks worldwide, draining literally billions of dollars from the digital economy. And their reach and complexity, we also know, continues to grow. Without regard for national borders, they have infiltrated social media, mobile devices, the cloud, and beyond, becoming harder to contain and truly and unfortunately complicating the solutions that we're seeking to deliver. The Internet of Things, for example, which introduced billions of new Internet-enabled devices to the world, also in parallel has created billions of new entry points for cyber criminals to exploit. And many of these devices simply weren't designed or deployed with security in mind, leaving consumers, businesses, and governments exposed. Compounding these developments, we also understand, is the weak security and oversight of, unfortunately, still many of our enterprise networks. Something as simple as a failure to install security updates, a lack of filtering, open DNS ports, or using outdated legacy and pirated software all create billions of new vulnerabilities for consumers, businesses, and governments alike. So just what really is at stake? Well, let me share some numbers with you. Currently, we know that the digital economy represents fully 1/3 of our gross domestic product here in the United States. Its growth continues only because individuals, enterprises, and government can trust implicitly the infrastructure, including our global, regional, and small broadband providers, which we proudly represent at USTelecom, to continue to deliver secure and reliable products and services. USTelecom and our members are deeply committed to the long-term health and prosperity of the digital economy, as well as the security of its underlying internet ecosystem. And our members, I just want to point out, were among the earliest adopters of voluntary best practices to secure the ecosystem from botnets. In 2012, the sector developed the first U.S. anti-botnet code of conduct for ISPs, taking very meaningful action towards rooting out botnets in education, detection, notification, remediation, and also collaboration. And every major internet service provider agreed to adopt the code. We also know that as the size of botnets increase, our members have serially added network capacity to protect consumers from increasingly large attacks. Even during major incidents, the Mirai botnet attack in 2016 comes to mind, government agencies observed that broadband networks proved to be remarkably resilient. Today, we're working hard, and I think creatively, with global partners across multiple industries now to dramatically reduce the botnet threat. And I'm also very proud that in February of this year, USTelecom and the Information Technology Industry Council formed the Council to Secure the Digital Economy to really facilitate more thoughtful, practical, and concrete solution sets and collaboration across the broader information communications and technology, the so-called ICT sector, joining together in common cause around a single table to drive practical solutions is a very important step, and we're glad that we have facilitated creating that table and bringing the major global companies around together in common purpose. The Council's first project, I mentioned the word practical, very practically, has been to develop a global guide to anti-botnet practices, informed by analysis of rapidly evolving global threats, ecosystem-wide vulnerabilities, and again, we know, increasingly capable, determined adversaries. And just last week, we announced that the Consumer Technology Association is going to join our effort in developing this guide. And that's going to be, I think, an incredible addition and asset to this important initiative going forward. The second project that we will be working on through the CSDE will be to mobilize relevant stakeholders to safeguard the digital economy in the event of a major cyber incident. This kind of preparatory work and collaboration coordination is fundamentally important to getting it right, and we're determined to use the CSDE platform as a vehicle, as a bulwark for being able to get that done. And both of these industry-led efforts are very closely aligned and in parallel with the efforts that are going on in the U.S. and international government policymaking efforts, and are going to require unprecedented, still even increasingly deep levels of collaboration across sector and geographic boundaries. I got to say that looking at a really awesome group of panelists today, I'm as confident as ever that these leaders, this report, and what will come from its recommendations truly signals what I mentioned is an inflection point in this serious war we are all engaged in against cyber criminals. USTelecom, I promise you, will continue to be your ally as we work with our members, our government partners, and our friends in the private sector, in the academy, in the research labs, and beyond to minimize current threats while staying one step ahead of whatever may come next. The health and continued progress of our global digital economy depends on nothing less. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce our friend, our colleague, a real leader in our collective efforts to drive practical solutions forward, our Senior Vice President of Cybersecurity, Robert Mayer, who is today's moderator for our great panel. So thank you very much.
Good morning, and if I can ask our panelists to join us, we'll make some quick introductions, and then we'll get into the interesting conversation. Very good. All right, well, thank you all for joining us today here personally, and to those of you who are watching this via the internet as well. I think for anybody who has even a casual interest in cybersecurity, these are very well-known panelists. These are all leaders in U.S. national cybersecurity policy development for many years. I'll make some quick introductions, but the full biographical information can be found in the handout. So let me go from my left here, and we'll move right down the line. Eric Winger is the Director of Government Affairs at Cisco. He leads the Cisco cybersecurity public policy work globally. He came to Cisco from Microsoft, where he was policy counsel. He was a trial attorney at the Department of Justice's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, and a special assistant U.S. attorney in D.C.'s Computer Hacking and Intellectual Property Unit. You don't want to mess with him. This guy knows the law. He knows all the technology, and we're very happy that Eric could join us. To Eric's left is a woman who probably needs no introduction, who has been extraordinarily helpful and influential in developing the work coming out of the 2017 Executive Order on cybersecurity. Evelin is Deputy Associate Administrator of the Office of Policy Development and Analysis. Since 2013, she helped lead NTIA's efforts to promote openness and innovation on the Internet as Deputy Associate Administrator. In addition to helping to guide the policy office's activity and staff, she's been tasked with leading NTIA's cybersecurity efforts, which includes partnering with stakeholders on the best ways to help them address cybersecurity challenges. And if I can say my own comment here, she's done an outstanding job in that effort. Another leader representing DHS is Helen Jackson, who's the Branch Chief of Partnership and Engagement in the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications. She leads the cybersecurity risk management programs that serving owners and operators of critical infrastructure in the public and private sectors. She manages national policy and information sharing forums, including, importantly, the President's National Security Telecommunications and Advisory Committee and the Network Security Information Exchange. And as we talk about the efforts leading up to this report, Helen is also the federally designated officer for NSTAC, which did a report that I'm sure my colleague Chris will discuss. And last but not least, Chris Boyer. I'm sorry. Did I miss Tim? Tim. That's okay. Tim, I'm sorry. I saw the word computer scientist and it went just like right by me. All right.
Yeah.
So
we do titles. So
Tim, how about I finish with Chris, sure, and then you will be the final kickoff, and I apologize. So Chris Boyer, Assistant Vice President for Global Public Policy for AT&T, is responsible for the company's policy positions and advocacy related to cybersecurity. He also represents AT&T's executive member with the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council, a federal advisory committee that advises the President on matters of national security and emergency preparedness. He serves as the chair of the Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board, another federal advisory committee responsible for identifying emerging managerial, technical, administrative, and physical safeguard issues related to information security and privacy. Mr. Boyer was very influential in facilitating the NSTAC report in November 2014, which we'll discuss today as well. And then my apologies to Tim Pogue with NIST, also a leader in this field, and very importantly produced in September, I believe, of 2017, the report on enhancing resilience of the Internet and communications ecosystem. And there are a lot of acronyms, Tim, that I'll try to not have to explain, but I know that you've been very much in the leadership of the International Internet Engineering Task Force and activities there, a leader in encryption, security, issues that have been in part plaguing and challenging us for decades. So thank you for joining us. So that's our panel. Let me begin with this question here and get your perception. So the report that was issued in May 11th of 2017 called for an open and transparent process involving multiple stakeholders. It called for coordination between the Department of Commerce and the Department of Homeland Security. And this open and transparent process was to develop a report, a draft report that was released in January of this year, and then a final report which was released in May that would create dramatic improvements in botnet and distributed attacks. So first question is, how successful in your opinion, was this open and transparent process? Because I do think without it, we probably wouldn't be where we are today. And then I want to follow up with that, and we'll have a separate question on the next steps, the roadmap activity. So,
I can start with that if you don't mind, because I don't want to leave it to the government folks to talk about how well the process worked. But I can say that, and so there were a number of key steps that I think that are a great example for other countries that are trying to examine these types of problems in terms of first having the executive order itself spell out the requirements, and then the process being open and participatory, voluntary to be able to join into. At every step along the way, we could see what direction the government was headed, and had an opportunity, because these are complex issues, to be able to weigh in and potentially offer advice about changes or edits that needed to be made. You had publication of questions to the public, workshops, a draft report which was required by the executive order back in January, additional workshops, a final draft that came out this year, pretty much almost exactly a year after the executive order, which was the timeline that was required. And so it was all spelled out in advance how it was going to work, and from where I sit, it seemed to work exactly as it was going to be described.
Great. I'll let Chris maybe speak to the other industry rep.
Yeah, sure. So I don't have anything. I don't disagree with Eric at all. I agree with everything he said. I think the process really stands up as an example of how the public-private partnership should work. It worked really well between Commerce and DHS. The agencies worked well together. The report was out in its timelines, and I think it was very useful for industry. There were plenty of opportunities for us to engage with government throughout the process. I'd like to think the INSTAC report that we did last year was a good lead into the NTIA and DHS report, because, or the Commerce report, because the INSTAC really had a lot of the same individuals. We brought in quite a few different folks to do briefings throughout that process, and so there was a good synergy where we had the DHS input feeding in through the INSTAC into the broader report that came out this year. And like I said, I think it was a good example of how the partnership process should work between industry and government.
And,
Yeah, I would just say from our perspective, ditto. We have every reason to be confident in the credibility and thoroughness of the process that brought us to this point. So it was very transparent, collaborative, and throughout the year that we've worked on this. So,
if I could just add one thing, I agree with everything. I'm glad to hear that industry thinks that it was so successful, but of course, a public and transparent process only is public and only really works if the private sector actually participates. And we were really delighted at, across multiple sectors, that we really got a very thoughtful and a participation. And we thank the community for that, because we know that we don't have all the good ideas. We really needed that engagement.
And if I could just add to, seconding the industry engagement, we couldn't have done this without that involvement, and also involvement from civil society as well, which we also appreciated throughout the way. And also just, as Chris mentioned, the government partnership between DHS and Commerce went very well. We all dived in and really worked hard to make that work, but it was also an interagency effort as well. We had great participation from DOJ and the Department of Defense and the FBI and the Department of State. So I just want to acknowledge that this was really whole of government, and it was a great example of the public-private partnership.
Great. Thank you. And Evelyn, I'm going to follow up and start with you. One of the, I think, most significant, if not the most significant change between the January 5th draft and the May 30th release was the section on next steps and
Right.
this roadmap process that you're about to undertake. If you could kind of explain how the, what was involved in kind of adding this to the report between January and May, and also very importantly, any insight you can share with us regarding how it goes forward from here in terms of timing, expectations, et cetera.
Absolutely, yes, thanks, Robert. First of all, thank you to Jonathan and Robert on USTelecom for having us today. We're very happy to be here and talking about the report. We're happy that it's published. In terms of next steps, what we heard, so when we came out in January with the draft report, we had the 5 mutually contributing goals. We had the many action items set out under those goals. And we had good community input, again, that this was the right direction to go. So we were pleased at that midpoint that there was so much consensus around what the actions were that needed to be accomplished. But what we did hear back, both on the government side and on industry and civil society as well, was these are all, we know we need to accomplish all of these things, but we all have minimal resources that we have to think about how we engage effectively. And so, how do we prioritize? How do we phase this? How do we do this in a way where we're doing the most important things first and the things that are hanging fruit, low-hanging fruit, so that we're able to move forward in the most efficient way possible. And so we really took hearing that to heart. And we knew that we needed to, in the next step, really come up with a way that we could get back together and get to those priority points. And so that's really why you see in the final report this next step of wanting to build the roadmap. But what we also said from day one with the report is that we were taking a year, which we were very pleased to have, because we wanted this report to be done in a way that was thoughtful and that was open and transparent and brought the right stakeholders together. But we also said, don't wait for this report to be done. Get started. If there are things that you can do, get out, and we'll accommodate for those in the process and along the way. And so one thing that's been really nice to see with the process is that no one is waiting for the roadmap. Industry is out already announcing things, the anti-botnet code of conduct that Jonathan talked about. There's other DDoS profiling going on the government side. NTIA just launched its next IoT multi-stakeholder process. NIST is getting out there. NSTEC is doing the moonshot effort. There's a lot of activity that's mentioned in the report that is already underway, which is great and a good sign that we're all headed in the direction. But what the roadmap is going to allow us to do is to capture those things and also build them into a more discrete process that lets us move forward collectively and to measure what we're doing and to be able to report back to both ourselves, because we're accountable as the community, but to our leaders in government and industry as well. So that process is what we're beginning to plan right now. On the government side, which also part of that new section, it's really about government being able to get out front and to lead by example. So we are currently in the process of talking and planning and deciding what the government piece of that is going to look like. We know that that action is happening on the industry side as well. So we're having those conversations, and what we expect that next month, probably early July, we'll call a meeting with the entire community, stakeholders again, to talk discreetly about the roadmap, and we'll get that process started. The report itself calls for a 120-day process, so we expect that to launch next month.
Okay.
Robert, if I may,
yeah,
I mean, I think the roadmap's really important, because when we did the Instack report last year, one of the observations that we had is that there's a lot of, I think if you pull people in the room, there's a lot of ideas that we all kind of know need to be implemented that can get us 80% of the way there. So kind of use an 80-20 rule that, if we did some of these basic practices, we could solve, or at least I won't say solve, because you're not going to solve botnets, but you can at least get 80% of the way there and make it a little bit harder for the botnets to affect us. But the issue is, how do we actually get some of these practices implemented? So when you look at these different reports, there's a lot of practices that are known in the industry that we've been talking about for a long time, but the idea is, how do you marshal the resources across the ecosystem, whether it's communications companies, whether it's IT companies, whether it's software, whether it's devices. How do we collectively kind of move each one of the industry segments forward and seeing that these things are implemented? A lot of them are already being implemented, like some of the recommendations for ISPs. I know that our industry is already doing some of those things, but there's a question about how do you do that at scale and in mass and in a large way across the entire industry. So I think having a roadmap and trying to draw out some of those timelines is really important to kind of moving things forward. And I completely agree with the idea of starting with I'll say the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit. You got to build momentum. So pick some things that we all can do quickly, build momentum, and then kind of go from there. But we need to figure out how to get these things actually implemented in addition to identified. And I think that's what the roadmap will be helpful for.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the roadmap?
I think I would like to say just two quick things. One is that I thought that the fact that industry and civil society wanted us to go farther and do a roadmap, to do prioritization, is excellent, because it indicates they're ready for this not to be shelfware. They're ready to participate, because they knew at that point that most of the actions are not government only, and they still wanted to know how we're going to make it real. And I think that was the most important thing that I drew from that.
We all acknowledge that we got to do something about DDoS attacks and botnets and those types of things. And so industry working with government, how do we move some of these ideas forward to actually deal with that problem? I think that's the next part of the conversation.
I think one other point here is that one of the nice things about having some continuity between the staff that have worked on some of the cybersecurity issues over the past few years and then continuing on now is that we see an effort to build upon what has been done in the past, and to make these things interoperable. So we're not developing something entirely new. We're trying to figure out how we can use the methodology of the NIST Framework and then apply that in a practical way to a problem like botnets. And so you see that in the report itself, where the language of how to categorize, identify, manage risk throughout the life cycle of threats it maps exactly to the NIST framework. And then we see a positive reference to the idea of building a profile to specifically apply the methodology of the NIST framework to this particular problem. And then, as Evelyn noted, that because of the way this process developed and because it was the result of a dialogue, the profile itself a draft of it had been offered as an example of a way to go by an industry group that we participate in, and AT&T as well. And then the report that ends up coming out makes a positive reference to that type of an approach as a start. So this is, I think, building on a strong foundation of work that has been done through other public-private partnerships, and then has been noted here during the development of this report. It was an iterative process itself. So the idea that you then take that and build out a roadmap makes complete sense as well too.
So thank you. I want to pull on that a little bit, unpack that, because you may recall that in 2012, the late Howard Schmidt, the first White House cybersecurity coordinator, made a statement when we were working on a botnet initiative, and he had indicated that we have to, quote, stop admiring the problem. It's now 6 years later, and I want to put the question to you, where are we positioned today to kind of not be accused of continuing to admire the problem? How do we move from, and I think you've alluded to it, but clearly we have to start acting and implementing now. So I'd like your perspectives on maybe what's changed over the last few years, and how are we now positioned to really have the impact that the White House had anticipated when they talked about dramatic reductions.
I'll just say real quick, just throughout this whole process in the last year, I mean, everybody's taken ownership of the problem already in a very collaborative, transparent way. So I think we have buy-in from most, if not all, of the communities that need to be a part of this. So I think that's a very good first step, and just starting here and taking action moving forward and not losing the momentum, I think, is key.
I think another reason, I mean, exactly correct that those communities are ready to participate, but I think also there's a broader, perhaps I would say more ambitious attack on the problem. I think that for years we've sort of said, ISPs, go solve this for us. And from the beginning in this process, there was a recognition, a broad recognition, that no one sector was going to solve the botnet problem by itself, and that other communities were going to have to also step up their game. And there's a lot of interlocking actions that are laid out here that says, well, one community is going to put together some technical piece, but then another community is going to do the awareness campaign or the assessments against that technical baseline. And that sort of community view of what it's going to take, I think, positions us to actually succeed.
Yeah.
And
I was just going to say that from an industry perspective, it's not like we've been sitting around waiting for the report to be issued to deal with botnets and DDoS and those types of things. Like, Eric mentioned the DDoS profile that we worked on at the coalition, but we've been dealing with this problem for a number of years since 2012. The issue, even before 2012, like the issues just shift. This is the nature of cybersecurity. So in 2012, we were dealing with how do we deal with the big DDoS attacks that were starting to happen on the U.S. financial institutions at the time. Since that time, ISPs have put in a significant amount of scrubbing capacity with different partners like Arbor and Cloudflare and other companies that do botnet and DDoS protection type services, and we all offer DDoS services to our customers. So that's been going on for a long time. The issue is that the nature of cybersecurity is these issues shift over time. So in 2012, we weren't even thinking about IoT-based DDoS attacks and bots, but now that's like the big focus of discussion that's going on. So the issues have changed, and we need to be thinking about like how do we continue to evolve the practices. And so this is an evolutionary thing to me. Like you're never going to get to a place where you say, oh, I'm done. Like we've solved botnets. It's just going to be the issues are going to shift, and then when they shift, we're going to have to be putting in place, practices that all the industry participants can implement to manage those shifts as time goes by. But that's just the nature of what we're dealing with in security.
As the report indicates, the threat surface has changed dramatically in the past number of years because of the endpoint devices that we are attaching that all have connectivity in them now that did not have them before. And so that means that the scale of the approach needs to change as well too. We also have some new tools at our disposal, including the ability to leverage AI and ML. We have a language that is common to us now to be able to describe how to categorize the problem and then the approaches that are available to attack them through the NIST framework. And so I think we have yes, there has been a problem for some time, but I think that there is a renewed consciousness about the scale and scope of the problem. There are some new tools at our disposal that we have available to us, and some new cooperative efforts, including the CSDE, the Council for the Digital Securing the Digital Economy, that Jonathan and Robert have mentioned. We have some technology that we are developing at Cisco at the network layer, which we think can help to create a richer dialogue between the devices in the network. We can, through the process of observing devices in the wild, be able to start to make some inferences about whether or not devices are acting as they're expected to or not, or in anomalous ways. But we can actually, through the development of profiles of these devices from the manufacturers, and this is referenced in the report too, it's something that we brought forward as an idea, and we're happy to see that it was referenced as being a positive development. But manufacturers can disclose how their devices are supposed to work in standardized ways that the network can then ingest and then help make informed decisions about whether or not a device is acting as expected or not. So we think, yes, the game has changed. The criminal actors that are trying to exploit the network and the devices through redirection and spoofing have changed their tactics some as well too. But we think the combination of new technologies, new approaches to using those technologies, and then the cooperation between the government, private sector, the civil society, that we can make a meaningful dent in this problem. As with all these problems, one of the things that makes it interesting is that it doesn't just go away. It does continue to morph and change, and so we're going to have to stay on the job.
Yeah, and then I'll just quickly add, because obviously agree with everything that's been said, but that I think that was was so visionary about this tasking and the executive order calling for an open and transparent process. When the executive order hit, we had been coming off of NIST and the community's development of the Cybersecurity Framework. NTIA had just launched its multi-stakeholder practice on IoT patching, which that group made really good progress in terms of communicating to consumers how devices are being updated, how they're being patched, and how manufacturers could do that. Back in 2006, and when the EO was announced in 2017, we were coming off of Mirai, we were looking at this new IoT environment, and there's been a lot of progress made even over the last year as we've built the report. There's a lot of innovation happening, and again, I think the visionary piece of this is the fact that what we've developed in the report is a formula. It's not a static approach. It is the way that we can keep staying agile as the adversary is agile as well. And so with this approach and the partnership, we'll be able to continue to adapt because we know that the threat is going to do that. So.
Great. All right, let me now go into a kind of a hardball question here. The report states that clear signals regarding product security and resilience will improve market incentives. What are these signals and how will consumers understand them? Can we really expect consumers to change current behavior, which seems to value cost and convenience over security, especially when their cameras may still be working during a DDoS attack?
I'll take this one first, especially since you're referencing cameras. Last week I was reading an article about a family that had discovered that their webcam that they were using to watch their child had been hacked. They realized that the webcam was being panned and refocused, and everyone who actually should have had access to, who had the authority to do that, was in the room with them. And so while they may not care that if the webcam continues to work, the same kinds of security issues that make that camera vulnerable to being added to a botnet are the ones that made it vulnerable to being compromised for their privacy. So I think users do care. Another quote from that article was, the woman said, "No one told me that I should, that this was a possibility and that I needed to look for some other kind of device." Part of the problem is we don't have any way right now to tell the average home user, this device gives you a better shot at security than some other. We really haven't given them the tools to try. I think this report talks about using some voluntary labeling schemes, some assessment schemes, different tools that might give us a way to package that information in a very user-friendly way and add some awareness campaigns to try to make this possible. So I've always claimed we never actually have tried to find out whether or not users will pay more. There certainly are surveys, like the Internet Society did a survey on routing security, internet security, and most customers said they would pay 10, 15% more to have a more secure connection, but they had no idea how they would actually ask for that. And so I'm hoping that if we can tell people how, some subset of the consumers will value that and will make that, a buying point. I think the last bit, and then I'll yield the floor on this one, is that, with things like crash testing with cars, it's not that every consumer cares about crash testing, but enough do that every auto manufacturer wants to be 5 stars. I think the same thing will be true here. We need a subset of consumers that will value that as part of it, and then I think that we will float all the manufacturers will want to do better.
But if I could also add, I think that we need to work to make it as easy as possible for consumers, making security as easy as possible. And I do think that there's been a lot of innovation happening in that area. Eric was talking about things that his company is working on. We're seeing other efforts, good innovation by companies to try to do this in a way that it's happening and that a consumer doesn't have to think too much about it. Yes, they should make better buying decisions, and we're trying to think of ways at the Department of Commerce to move the market so that consumers do have more transparency and they can make better buying decisions. But we do have to make it easier. Most consumers wouldn't know how to wire their house, right? And so, but they know who to call. And so we really need to be moving to those modular ways that they know where to get information, they know what to do with the information. And I think as the report points out in terms of adoption and awareness and education, we have work to do there. But innovation is going to help to make it as easy for consumers as it can be.
Just to add to that point, I think doing something like an Energy Star, some sort of labeling probably makes sense to help consumers make informed decisions about what they do. That there's obviously pitfalls with that approach because when you test a device and you say it meets some certain criteria, in our world, it's only good for that period of time when the test was performed, because the first update that gets issued could potentially make it vulnerable again. But I think there's merit in trying those approaches and seeing where consumers go. I'll have to say that I'm a little skeptical that we have to keep in mind that we can't push the responsibility for security just down to the customers, right? Because this is way too complicated. And if we're going to rely upon consumer end users to be their own system administrators and secure the environment, that's bound to fail in the long run. And I've been doing consumer awareness stuff around cyber for years, since I served on the board of the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and we've been struggling with this issue for a long time. Like, how do we cut through all the noise that's already out there to get consumers to actually pay attention to internet security and make informed decisions? And that's been a huge challenge for a long time. And I think if we make it easy for them, if we use something that's that help them look at and understand better, that might make it a little more viable than it's been in the past. We haven't really tried that, but at the end of the day, we still need to be thinking about how do we build in better security in the network and in the devices that's abstracted from the user, where we're not entirely dependent upon the user to go patch and push an update to their device. Like, we need to have the ability in the network to monitor devices and apply things like data analytics to identify deviations and patterns and see what devices are doing, and then apply security controls against them so we can actually manage that environment. In the long run, that's where I think this is going to have to go in order to really truly move the needle, because if we're dependent upon consumers, you're only as strong as your weakest link, and that's traditionally been the challenge. So building in some combination of consumer education with better tools and better resources, and doing more innovation in the network level and the device level. And I know Eric can speak to what Cisco is doing with like the MUD, the multi-user, or the manufacturer usage description standard IETF. There's a combination of things that probably need to happen here to really make this better.
Yeah, we all love consumer education, but I think Chris makes a great point, which is that you have to figure out what's reasonable for consumers to understand,
right.
What is reasonable to expect them to do on their own, and do we have the right kinds of incentives to make those kinds of things happen. And then once we recognize the things that consumers can't be reasonably expected to take on on their own, then we need to figure out ways to build that somewhere else into the system. And so again, I push the idea that there may be pieces of this that we want to try to take care of at the network level. There are things we've done at the consumer level, for instance, where I think everybody now agrees that we don't want to see devices shipped that have hard-coded credentials that can't be changed. But at the same time, you want to see a process whereby when a device is first started up, that there is some sort of prompt that tells the user to change the password. And then we've seen also great advances in the technology itself, kind of giving a score on the proposed password that a user offers. So there are things that we can do to nudge consumers to make better decisions once we have some understanding of the kinds of things that they ought to do. It's interesting that you saw this past year that the National Cybersecurity Center out of the UK offered new advice about passwords to end users, and essentially moved away from this idea that we should be changing our passwords every 6 weeks to things that are too complicated to remember. And instead they say, change your passwords when you know that something you've gotten some sort of flag that there's a problem. which is, so we need to do some more studying about what are the kinds of things that consumers can be reasonably expected to do. And then for the things that they can't be expected to do, we need to figure out ways to address those threats in other parts of our model.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that, this is actually the area of the roadmap that we're looking for a lot of civil society and academic leadership on, and so we look forward to their participation as we move forward in on that effort, because this is an area that's just calling for leadership from that sector. So.
And just one other really quick point. When I talk about how we can do things at the network level, what I mean by network is the whole end-to-end piece, right? So it could be the devices in the home. It could be, you could put an adjunct device in the house that manages the home environment. I know there's security companies looking at offering that capability. You could do things in the home routing environment. You can do stuff in the LTE 5G networks. You can do stuff back in the cloud at the application layer. So this is why it's important that we think of this thing as an ecosystem issue across the board, where each different entity has different solutions they can bring to the table to address some of these problems.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. When I say the network, I mean generically other layers in the stack,
Yeah, the whole
besides
stack.
the end user device. So that could be, again, at the in the LAN level. It could be many other places but
Right.
we just can't we can't assume that we can push all this down to the end user and expect them to understand it and make the right decisions.
Right.
Okay, what I want to do is, getting close, I want to give folks in the audience a chance to ask some questions before I go on with my questions. So if you have a question, I think somebody has a microphone to hand to, thank you. You can just say your name and affiliation, and that'd be great. Okay.
Hi, Eric Geller from Politico. In the U.S., you can't sell a car without meeting certain federal safety standards. And in this conversation, industry always likes to say, let's have voluntary agreements, let's all agree to do certain things. I'm wondering why, and the industry argument is always, things are changing very fast. We can't set standards because in 2 years, 5 years, the expectations are going to be different. But there are certain things that are never going to be a bad idea. It's never going to be a bad idea to require a user to set a password that's not the default. It's never going to be a bad idea to push patches rapidly and over a long product life cycle. Those things are never going to change. Why shouldn't some agency set requirements where you can't sell a router unless it requires you to change the password when you buy it? What is the downside to very basic regulation for those things that everybody can agree on are always going to be good ideas? What's the counter argument there, and why isn't that being explored in this discussion?
So I'll just talk to something that we are recommending, that we do recommend in the report. And in that news section, we do talk a lot about the government leading by example. And one of the areas that we do highlight is government procurement policy. And this is one way that we can help to move the market. As I mentioned, that is one of our big emphasis in terms of changing standards, is being able to help the market to respond on its own. And so procurement is one way, and that's something that DHS itself has been looking at, and the interagency players as well. But I think that, the truth is that, that is a way that to work things that's a little bit more agile. It doesn't stick things in a place that are hard to move. It allows us to be more flexible when we're doing procurement policy. So that is one of the reasons why you see that as an emphasis in the report.
So I guess from the NIST point of view, we're a non-regulatory agency, and voluntary standards is what we do. And we firmly believe that that good voluntary standards that meet consumer needs and that are practical to actually implement and meet performance-based standards, those kinds of standards have the longest and most positive impact in terms of how we work with the market. I mean, that's just the way we view the game. Certainly there are sectors where some devices are actually regulated already. I mean, you know, HHS regulates medical devices, and those places where there's a clear safety issue, I think that those agencies are already trying to step up. You know, the question of whether or not broad regulation is a more powerful way to do it, that's just simply not, from our viewpoint, the way that we would work. Obviously, if all of this fails, who knows? But that's not that was certainly not the goal in this report, is what can we do by partnering?
I'll put it this way. We do already have regulators who make decisions about the types of technologies that move into highly sensitive environments, like control rooms for nuclear power plants or water filtration or hospitals. And so it's entirely appropriate for the regulators there to make decisions about what kinds of capabilities they want to see as a minimum baseline before a device is allowed to operate in those types of environments. We wouldn't, however, try to regulate the production of teapots generally just because somebody might try to bring one inside of a nuclear control room, right? So what you want to do is you want to make sure that the regulator has the ability to decide what types of things happen. Otherwise, we would end up with a teapot that would cost $300 and nobody would be able to afford one. So the trick is that in those regulated spaces, we have existing regulatory authorities that can be adapted to try to address these kinds of technologies. At the other end of the spectrum, there are acts and practices that I think over time the market will agree should not be in anything that is offered new for sale. And this is where having something flexible like the Federal Trade Commission, who can look at where there are, they have brought litigation in a number of cases where they have attacked practices being so far outside the mainstream that nobody should be doing them anymore. In the middle, between those regulated spaces and the things that we're trying to weed out of the market altogether through litigation, we need to have a flexibility to innovate. And that's the beauty of the way that the internet works, is that you have the freedom for, you know, for a large company like Cisco, we can easily meet the requirements that are widely agreed upon for the market. But what you want to do is you also want to encourage small actors to be able to develop something completely new and innovative that nobody's ever thought of before. And if we put too many requirements on the front end before something is developed, then we'll never see those things.
So from my standpoint, and I've mentioned this before, that I think what would be really helpful in this space is something like the NIST framework for the IoT space. You know, when the current framework was developed, which was really for enterprise IT and critical infrastructure, that, you know, I think we were at a very similar inflection point to where we are now in IoT. We were seeing an increase in different numbers of attacks. We were trying to figure out, you know, the government was trying to figure out what to do about that. There were different pieces of legislation that had been proposed. You know, I think we're in a very similar place on IoT right now. And what would be really helpful is something that pulled, I know NIST is doing a lot of activities, and there's a lot of things going on inside government related to IoT, but pulling those pieces together and having something like a framework. And what you could do there is you could have a framework that is kind of a basic baseline, kind of going to your question, Eric, about how there's a baseline of simple requirements that all devices should generally fulfill that cuts across the different verticals, and then each individual vertical, whether it's healthcare or if it's automotive or what have you, could then apply additional requirements depending upon the device itself and what it's being used for. Because the security controls, to me, are more about the risk, so they have to be commensurate with the risk and the use case for the device. So the same device that's used in an automotive, in a vehicle, that's used in another, or maybe that's not a good example, but a same device used in different environments can have different risks and different requirements. So depending upon where you are in the vertical. So a framework that cuts across with some additional would be, I think, a good outcome. It would allow for industry to be flexible enough, because it would be voluntary, where you could change it and morph it over time as things change. And in Eric's point, I think, like we've seen with the current NIST framework, the FTC would most likely map their, quote, reasonableness standard, you know, to that framework, and they would set some baseline expectations that if you're building an IoT device, you should be acting reasonably and therefore using this framework that's been developed. And if you're not, you potentially take on the risk of additional litigation. And so it creates a hook. In addition to that, we know that like your Underwriters Laboratory and other entities are all looking at testing and certification regimes in the market so they can benchmark their testing programs against something like that. So, you know, I've said this before in different events, but I think that would be really helpful in IoT. It would also help pull the pieces together from all the kind of disparate things that are going on inside government right now and organize it in a way that would be helpful for industry.
Thank you. We have time for one or more questions. Yes, Charlie. Get the
Thanks. Charlie Mitchell with Inside Cybersecurity. I was just interested in terms of the process going forward, if you envision something that will be like the NIST framework process in terms of the engagement, and if there are lessons from that process, that 2013 to 14 period where there was a very, very intense engagement among all the stakeholders. Have you learned things from that that you think will make this even more effective or more effective? And one piece of that is maybe the public awareness thing of the NIST framework got to a lot of communities, but there's still a lot of people who hadn't heard of it. And how do you get this to some of those harder to reach communities? And also, just to follow up very briefly on Eric's question, which I know you all loved about the regulation, but are there, you don't have to call anybody out if you don't want to, but are there pieces of the ecosystem here, as you're looking at this particular problem, that may need more prodding than a voluntary process can get at? They may need more compulsory reasons to go forward and improve their security.
So maybe we take the first question first. And then,
Since all the question had a lot to do with the profile process, and then from NIST, let me start and say certainly we've learned a lot through the framework process and through our continued engagements as we worked on the subsequent updates to that document. And I think that one of the parts that we envision as we work here is certainly that the engagement didn't stop because the report is published. The engagement is going to have to continue. It's going to have to be detailed. We're probably going to have to spend more time together than we did during the process of writing the report, because now we're trying to coordinate action, and that's going to be even more difficult and more important. And the investments that we're all making will be more significant. So we've certainly learned a lot through the framework process, and we are trying to incorporate that as we go forward. The second piece that I would say is that when we did the framework was intended for critical infrastructure. And one of the things that you'll find now is that we sort of recognize that the framework is for everyone. And so there has been a broadening there in terms of targeting who do we need to have our engagement with. In this case, I think we started out knowing it is the whole ecosystem that we're talking about, and we do have to be broadly engaged from the beginning. The other piece I will point out is that I don't really think that awareness campaigns were really part of what they were thinking about when they were building the framework. They were just trying to meet that one-year process. In this particular case, you'll find that one whole goal is about education and awareness. There's an awful lot talking about how are we actually going to get customers to understand the implications of these actions and how do they use them. And I say customers, and I don't mean just the homeowner, but I mean also in the enterprises that need to be buying and deploying these products. So we've filtered a lot of that in from the beginning. So I think that we have learned. Hopefully, we'll do it even better than that process, which was pretty successful, even as it was.
Yes, but if I could just quickly add, I mean, so I think we want to make a separation too between what we're doing on the roadmap building process, which is a broader community-wide to include other interagency partners as well. I mean, we've had lots of, there's been law enforcement involvement in writing this report. There's been Department of State. And this is a whole of government and a whole of industry and civil society effort. If you look at goal 1 of the report, which is a lot where the profiling pieces are taking place. I mean, we only see that as one step in the process. So there are multiple partners, there are multiple, I mean, the framework was NIST getting together with its community and building that, and we all embrace it. But now the way that we I would say one of the ways that this is different is that under the EO, we've started with a broader constituency and a broader group of players that I think have given it, even from the outset, that broader lens, and there is more focus on adoption and awareness, and so I think you'll see a much more sort of coordinated, holistic approach overall, not just on the technical piece, but these other sort of market-focused pieces to the puzzle around adoption and awareness that are very important.
I have a slightly different take on the framework. I mean, I think it's absolutely clear from the original executive order that the original purpose of it was to focus on critical infrastructure, but I think right from the outset that there was a goal of trying to make sure that it had the potential to be more broadly applicable than to just its original intended audience. And in terms of the regulatory piece of that, uptake of it, the original executive order also had language in there that specifically required federal agencies to look to the framework as an input for their mandatory regulations. So we talk about the framework as being voluntary. It's voluntary in three different ways. It's voluntary in the sense that the process for joining in and advising the government on development of it was voluntary. It was built on voluntary consensus-based standards, as is required by federal law. And then the use of it, we say is voluntary. It sort of depends on where you sit. Because there are existing regulatory authorities that have the ability to use that framework and then to develop their mandatory requirements with that as an input for it. The difference is that the regulations that would come out of a framework-based approach would be process-oriented rather than being prescriptive. Right. Now, I think it's an interesting and open question about whether or not you then take that original framework document and then you just try to develop profiles or overlays from the framework, or do we say that the general approach is going to be applicable in other places, but we need a separate document for something like IoT. And so I think that's something we need to work out. But I think another thing that's, from my perspective, was powerful about the framework was that had there been a push at the outset to make it mandatory for everybody to use, there would have been significant resistance from industry, I can promise you. But what ended up happening was that it sparked conversations inside of organizations about what risks they needed to manage and how to manage them, so that the conversations about managing risk moved out of being something that we have a great deal of familiarity with managing risk in the business side, on the financial side. How do we make leadership in organizations think about managing risk around cyber and IT as something that they think about in the same sort of frame? And the cybersecurity framework has done that very successfully. It's been so successful that we start to see now questions about how to translate that across organizational boundaries, so that I can describe the way I manage risk in a way that Chris can understand whether or not he wants to do business with me. And so those are the kinds of things that will evolve from the framework. They can be boiling it down so that it's more usable by smaller businesses, helping to make sure that we can translate it across organizational boundaries, and also figuring out ways that we can apply the basic learnings of it to new types of problems beyond the original critical infrastructure set that was the impetus for it. So.
Just to add real quick, in terms of the framework and lessons learned from that, DHS was charged with helping to promote use of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And part of that challenge is reaching scale and reaching particularly the small, mid-sized business communities and finding ways to help them leverage the framework. So I think going into this process too, that's something to keep in mind is, how do we do that and do it effectively and efficiently?
Yeah, picking up on that theme, like I think the reason I think that an IoT framework would be potentially a better option than doing a profile is because the profiles are kind of inside baseball in DC. Like people that get engaged in that already know about the framework, they're actively involved in the framework process. Whereas if you do a bigger initiative with a bigger reach, something like the framework itself, like when I went to the very first framework kickoff meetings that NIST held, we had probably 500 some odd people coming to those sessions, right? So doing a big initiative creates bigger scale, broader reach and we'll get more attention to it than just doing a profile, in my opinion. And that's why. And also, I think there's a lot of stuff happening inside government that is going on the IoT issue, but there's not a lot of visibility into it. So if you organized all those pieces and you expanded the scope and did something that's like a little bigger initiative, it would resonate more with a bigger audience. It also would resonate more with Capitol Hill.
So I think, Chris, you have the last word today. I want to, if you can join me in thanking our excellent panel for today's event. Appreciate it. And please stay tuned for our 12th forum, which will happen, I'm sure, sometime probably this year. So thank you for attending all.